مرحبا طارق علي، وشكرا على حضورك معنا في حوارات فكرية. سؤالي الأول يتعلق بحرب الإبادة المستمرة على غزة. طارق علي، أنت من الوجوه اليسارية التاريخية المعادية للإمبريالية والمناصرة للحق الفلسطيني، وقد لعبت دورا مهما في حراك ستينات القرن الماضي ضد الحرب الأمريكية على فيتنام. هل من وجه تشابه طارق علي بين التعبئة الشبابية الحالية في بريطانيا وفي أوروبا وفي الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ضد حرب الإبادة الجماعية على غزة، والحراك الذي شاركت فيه ضد الحرب على الفيتنام؟ وهل نحن أمام شكل جديد من الحراك في الشمال العالمي المناهض للحروب الاستعمارية وللإمبريالية؟
Well, many people have asked, how does this movement today compare to the movement of the 60s and 70s against the Vietnam War? And the fact is, and we must always remember this, that that movement took place in a very different world. That the context of the anti-Vietnam War movement was revolutions happening in different continents against the United States and against other colonial powers. And so the movement against the Vietnam War became part of a movement for overall social change or social revolutions. It was a time of hope, a time of optimism, a time when people felt that all they had to do was get up from their seats and go on the streets, and that would be the end. It didn't happen like that, but that was the mood. Today's world is very different. Today's world is a world where the United States is the dominant imperial power and has dominated the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union, effectively, and believes that it can do whatever it wants to this world. So, two things are important to remember. One, that the Iraq War in the early years of this century was opposed by most of the world. Most of the citizens in European countries were not in favor of that war. Millions of people marched, but the war took place. And that war took the lives of 1 million plus Iraqi men, women, and children. And it hasn't achieved anything. We are speaking today many years after that war, nearly over a decade and a half. And they still have not managed to restore electricity for Iraqi citizens. The social conditions are awful. So why do they go and wreck countries? The same in Libya, the same in Syria. That is what they've been doing. Now, the question I ask myself and discuss with Palestinian friends especially is, why did Palestine strike such a chord when people have, seen many atrocities happening before this, but didn't do anything? And I think it's a combination of two factors. One, that the Israeli government's arrogance, the way they talked about the Palestinians, the way they said they were going to avenge what Hamas supposedly did, the resistance, and then they carried it out day after day after day. And that, I think, shocked the world, which had been told that we were living in different times, that all the good countries were with the United States now. And people seeing with their live streaming genocide, that's what people saw. Children being killed, their mothers being killed, hospitals being destroyed, old people being killed, indiscriminate attacks on buildings, on houses, so that within 2 weeks, Gaza, it didn't seem to exist anymore. And that began to anger people, young people especially, but not only. And they came out. Also, add to this that there was no official opposition. In Britain, you had the Labour Party, just as bad as the Conservatives, not opposing the government, backing the government. This guy who will most likely be Britain's next Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, saying in public that the Israelis had a right to stop the water supply, had a right to stop the electricity, had a right to do what they were doing. And so the opposition, which didn't exist in Parliament, came up on the streets. We have, since October the 7th, we have had 18 large demonstrations, huge, half of these 18 involving more than 250,000 people marching on the streets. They haven't been able to stop them. They tried to, but they couldn't because the mood was so angry. And that remains the case, and it's now affecting politics in this country. George Galloway stood against Labour in a by-election. He won. I hope others will too on July the 4th. I don't know. But there is this anger which also reflects, in my opinion, both here and in the United States, a generational shift. Because among the young people marching are lots and lots of young Jewish people who don't like Zionism, who don't like being identified with Israel, and who are marching for Palestine. In the United States, it's quite amazing. Young Jewish people coming out and occupying Grand Central Station in solidarity with the victims, with the Palestinian victims of Israel's war of revenge. And they don't know how to deal with it. So basically, the only force they know is violence. The encampments that have sprung up in God knows how many, over 100 colleges and universities in the United States. Wonderful, wonderful acts of solidarity. On their own, they can't change anything, but they show the White House and its people in this country that you may get away with it, but the costs are going to be high. And I think that's what we're witnessing now, a generational shift, and where these people will end up, we shall see. But people are no longer prepared to remain silent on Palestine. They're no longer prepared to be blackmailed by memories of the Judeocide or the Holocaust, as they call it. They're saying, no, that was horrible, we know that. But you can't use that to justify this. And that, I think, is a big, big step forward. That Palestine is recognized by millions and billions of people all over the world. So the tragedy is, in my opinion, that whereas many countries in South America, Chile, Bolivia, Venezuela, Mexico, have punished Israel, broken off relations with it, attacked it, stopped trading even, the Arab world, people who rule the Arab world, remain quiet. Not the ordinary people, they're angry. But for many of them, it's a choice. If we go out, if we really go out onto the streets. They'll taser us, they'll lock us up, they'll torture us. What can we do? So it's a very sad situation in the Arab world as a whole, but we shall see. It's not over yet. I mean, today, the day you are doing this interview, the Israeli government minister has said we will bomb Lebanon back into the Stone Age. This is the language they use. Stone Age. Palestinians are not human beings. You have a Zionist woman screaming on Israeli television, yes, I regard my children as better, safer, and more human than Palestinian children. And the West watches. These so-called defenders of civilization against barbarism have become the barbarians. For most of the world, they are the barbarians today. The Europeans and the Americans who have allowed this genocide to take place.
أنت كاتب له إنتاج غزير، كتبت في السياسة وكتبت في الرواية وكتبت سيناريوهات أفلام، ومؤلفك الأخير يحمل عنوان تشرشل عصره جرائمه. تشرشل His Times His Crimes. لماذا تخصيص كتاب حول تشرشل؟ وما هو الهدف من ذلك؟
Churchill has been made into a complete cult in this country for the last 30, 40 years. And it's been made impossible to challenge him. So you have this huge cult without any real critique. There's some very good books that have been written, but the domination of this section of history that involves Churchill by people on the right, really, or people who don't want to say anything critical of him. And when the students, the anti-colonial students, started, saying, putting paint on his statues and paint on Churchill College, many people said to me, you should write a book. Because it's fine to, occasionally paint the statue, but people should know a bit more about his history. And so the main aim of the book was to write a history, not just of Churchill, but of the period in which he was born, he grew, and how he became the figure he was, and why he is being used like he is being used today. And that was really the reason. And as I started working on this book, I found out so many things that hadn't been written about in detail before, about Churchill's record, about what he actually believed in, not just out abroad in the colonies, but in Britain itself. He was against giving women the vote. He wanted a restricted democracy. He thought that working class agitation in Britain they were enemies, etc., etc. And so that really got me going, and the response has been very good, in my opinion. Lots and lots of young people write to me saying, we had no idea. Thank you for writing the book. We had absolutely no idea. And this comes from abroad as well, not just here. An Arabic edition is being published in Cairo. I hope she hurries up, my publisher. But it's a total critique of the colonial mindset which Churchill typified, and the defense. And it's very interesting to see what a strong defender of Zionism he was. Right in the early days, in the 1920s, he was for that. And what was his famous sentence? He said that just because the dog is in the manger, It doesn't mean he can be there forever. New people can come into the manger. And they are. So it's become quite an interesting book in the sense that talking about it to people at the time when we're seeing a genocide taking place in the Middle East, where Churchill went often, where he fought, uh, where he was extremely hostile to the Palestinian cause.
لنبدأ بالحديث عن جرائم تشرشل. أنت كتبت أن التفقير الممأسس شكل العلامة المميزة للاستعمار البريطاني في الهند. هل لك طارق علي أن تشرح لنا ذلك في حالة البنغال؟
What happened in Bengal was the following. You had a famine. The reason you had a famine, because all the rice that was being produced in Bengal was being shipped out to feed the soldiers fighting the Second World War. This triggered off a famine which got worse and worse. And no help was provided. The government in London, Churchill and Attlee, Conservative and Labour, said the priority was to feed the soldiers fighting the war. Now, that was obviously their priority. It was not the priority of the Bengali people. Millions died. We still have no exact idea. It's debated how many millions died. But it was millions, not hundreds of thousands of people. And the descriptions from that period are just horrific. And interestingly enough, it created a divide within the British establishment, because Lord Wavell, who's then the British Viceroy in India, wanted help given to the Bengalis. His wife went to Bengal. She said, I have never seen human beings looking like animals. And that is what is happening in Bengal today. People dying on the streets, human beings scavenging for food like animals do. And the British High Command in India was quite concerned about this and said they will never forget this. But nothing, no response for Churchill. At some dinner party, at I think the Lord Mayor's reception in London at the time, Churchill was asked about the famine. And he said, is Gandhi dead? They said, no, Gandhi isn't dead. He said, then what's the famine? It couldn't be that effective a famine. So that was the mentality, that Indian lives, Bengali lives didn't matter. And so they died. They really did die in large numbers. There's some very fine documentaries about it, and the great Bengali filmmaker Satyajit Ray made a film about the famine. And it marked the life and culture of Bengali people for some time. And I always tell my Bengali friends, especially when they're in power, at least set up one museum in Kolkata or wherever else you want, the Museum of the Bengal Famine, in which all the evidence is laid out and children are taken and educated week after week from all the Bengali schools to show that this is what happened. This was one of the worst colonial crimes. Not the only one, but one of the worst colonial crimes committed by the British in India.
أنت اعتبرت في كتابك الأخير تشرشل عصره جرائمه أن هذه المجاعة كانت عنصراً أساسياً في انفجار العنف العرقي في كالكوتا سنة 1946، وهو ما أدى حسب شرحك إلى تقسيم شبه القارة الهندية بين بلدين هما الهند وباكستان. فلماذا طارق علي حسب رأيك أيدت بريطانيا هذا التقسيم؟ وما كانت مصلحتها في ظهور هذا البلد الجديد باكستان؟
It's a long debate. I think it was a combination of two things. The British, wherever they have ruled, it's always been divide and rule. Always. Whether it's Africa, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Ireland, divide and rule, because that's the simplest way. Divide the populations from each other, use one section of the population, you know. It's the same in Cyprus. And they did the same in India. And by the time they realized that perhaps other solutions were possible, it was too late, because the seeds had been sown. And then I have to say this, had the Congress Party, the big freedom party in India, which fought for Indian independence, been more generous-minded, more open in how it dealt with the Muslim parties, who knows what would have happened. At critical moments in the history, from 1940, during the war years, 39 to 45 and later, the Congress basically refused to have any compromises. Even Gandhi said to them, don't do this. Make Muhammad Ali Jinnah the Muslim League leader. Let him become the president of India. So what? They wouldn't agree to that. It was a majoritarian impulse from them. And Nehru and Patel, left and right of the Congress Party, didn't disagree on this particular issue. And it got worse and worse. And then you had the announcement of partition, and then the killing started, people fleeing, people losing children, people losing property, refugees. And some years later, in fact, 30 years or less than 30 years later, Pakistan broke up into Pakistan and Bangladesh. So the whole idea of creating a state based exclusively on a commonality of religion didn't work out. The Bengalis had their own language, their own culture. They were a majority in the new state of Pakistan, but the state was run by the army, the landlords, the civil servants who were mainly from West Pakistan. So religion didn't enter into it. It was a simple question of democracy, accountability, etc. So Jinnah's Pakistan broke up in 1971. And so we are left with three countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And it will probably remain like this now. I don't know, but it's unlikely that anything really positive could happen. So one just wishes they lived in peace. They didn't provoke each other. The Indians here, especially under the Modi government, are responsible for exacerbating various issues which could be solved and sorted out very easily in a normal, rational way by these countries. But Modi doesn't want to do it. He will do it if Pakistan gives up the right, not Pakistan, if Pakistan accepts that India taking over Kashmir, then Modi will do a deal with the Pakistanis. Can't do that. It would be a total betrayal of the Kashmiri people's right to self-determination. You know, they will get a Palestine-style situation, which already exists to a certain extent, because Indian atrocities in Kashmir are not that different from what the Zionists are doing to Palestine.
طارق علي، أنت تعتبر أنه ولفهم الوضع في الشرق الأوسط اليوم من الضروري العودة إلى السنوات الأولى من مسيرة تشرشل الإمبريالية، وتحديداً إلى مؤتمر سان ريمو الذي انعقد سنة 1920. هل بإمكانك أن تشرح لنا هذه المرحلة التاريخية وتحدثنا عن نتائجها في المنطقة العربية؟
The tragedy of the Middle East was the fact that the British and French empires, after the First World War, decided to break them up into small countries and create new countries. I mean, we're talking about Lebanon today because the Israelis threaten it. What is Lebanon? It's a tiny strip taken out of Syria and made into a country by the French colonialists who felt that they could control it better. And it's based on a complete lie that the population division, the overwhelming majority is Muslim. But they can't have a census in that country because a census would reveal that. So they pretend Christians and non-Christians are the same, which they are not, you know. So this division, I'm just using this to show the divisions that they have made. And I always say to friends who ask, during the Ottoman period, the cities of the Middle East were the most important cities. You know, Jerusalem, Amman, Damascus, Cairo. You could go to a primary school in Jerusalem, a secondary school in Amman, a university in Cairo, and feel what you were in Arab, whether you were a Arab Muslim or a Christian Arab or even a Jewish Arab. That's what you were. And this basic Arab identity, which the Ottomans didn't interfere with, on the contrary, the people the Ottomans hated the most were the Chinese sects, the Wahhabis, for instance, because they were disruptive. And they went and sorted them out. And the Wahhabis then, of course, backed the British and French empires after the defeat of the Turks in the First World War. I often think, what if the Turks hadn't taken part in that war? It was foolish of them to do so and remain neutral. Would it have been possible to take these places away from them? Who knows? Who knows? But taken away they did, divided in order better to rule, artificial countries manufactured, and that stayed. So you have a situation where the British, to a lesser extent the French, create these regimes, create monarchies, or sheikdoms in the Gulf, give the Wahhabis Saudi Arabia, and make sure these regimes are never friendly with each other. And then the 50s erupt, again linked to Palestine, that the Nakba of 1948, if you look, Nasser, Mohyuddin, and other young Egyptian officers fought in that war, supposedly, but were never given what they required, were never given enough weapons, orders were changed, and they felt they were being sabotaged. Nasser describes this in his autobiography of the First Palestinian War. And these young officers, radicalized by the failure of their monarchies, and their presidents during the first war, the Nakba war in Palestine, get radicalized. And so in all these countries, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, you have radical uprisings. And there's great excitement in the Arab world again. For the first time since the Ottomans lost control, for an Arab republic, an Arab nation. And that project, which really the United States was completely opposed to, was then crushed largely by Israel. I mean, first the 1956 war to try and topple Nasser in Egypt, and then the 67 Six-Day War, which was an open assault on Arab nationalism, and unfortunately, we have to say, succeeded. And it's for the first time since the Six-Day War that we are now seeing a slightly changed mood again, with people throughout the Arab world looking at the Palestinians being killed and fighting, and who knows what will come out of this particular phase. But the big tragedy is that the Arab governments and Arab elites, they talk a lot, sometimes they do nothing. You know, for the Egyptians, not to insist with force if necessary, to take water and food and clothes and medicines to the Palestinians, but just to accept the Israeli dictators. Disgusting. And the Americans knew what they were doing when they bought over the Egyptian army. They knew exactly what they were doing. And the king of Morocco doesn't even trust his own countrymen to guard him. Mossad organizes his bodyguard. You know, these are the people in charge of the Arab world now. And Turkey making a lot of noise. You know, I wrote recently about it's like a donkey republic, with the Sultan of donkeys braying a lot, but actually doing nothing. You know. So this is the world we live in, and the Palestinians have woken it up again. But what will happen? I mean, we can only speculate if the Israelis go in and try and take out Hezbollah. The reaction will be tougher than that of Hamas, basically, because Hezbollah are better armed, they are better prepared. They're the only political force in the Middle East that have inflicted a defeat on the Israelis. Till this Hamas attack now, which the Israelis certainly see as a defeat. You know, to have had Hamas soldiers and troops on Israeli territory for 4 days, saying, what does that message say? It says to the people of Israel, your governments can't protect you. And lots of people have left. You know, not millions, they don't have millions, but I'm told that hundreds and thousands of people with dual nationalities have left Israel. So it's, and this is not going to be cured by attacking Hezbollah, unless they want to provoke the Americans into a war with Iran, and then the whole business is up for grabs again. But one thing I note, that in the middle of all this, you have this tiny part of Yemen run by the Houthis. Just speak with real courage. I cheer them when I see them. You know, this young officer comes and says, today we attacked this American ship, this British ship. We will not allow anyone to take anything into Israel while it is carrying on. And you just say, thank God, thank you for doing it. And you see their army marching on the streets with crutches, you know, without arms, many of them, but still marching for Palestine. And if all the Arab world did that, this war would be over very soon. The Americans would stop it.
تشرشل صرح في خضم الثورة الكبرى ضد الإمبراطورية البريطانية عام 1920: أنا أؤيد بشدة استعمال الغاز السام ضد القبائل غير المتحضرة. هل لك طارق علي أن تشرح لنا السياق الذي جاء فيه هذا الإعلان؟
Churchill was a bloodthirsty politician. He believed very firmly that Britain and Europe represented civilization and the rest of the world, except where there were white settlements, were barbarians. And so using poison gas against Kurdish tribes as they did, and using the Air Force to hit targets during the Great Uprising in Palestine from 36 to 39, that was Churchill. He wanted to do it and he did it. And the poison gas had been used in the First World War by the Germans and by the British against each other. So for Churchill, using poison gas against the Arabs was merely an extension. Who cares? They're Arabs after all. We don't care. Just do what has to be done. You know, that was the attitude, not just of Churchill, but of most colonial politicians. You know, if you look at what the French did in Algeria, just as horrific.
تشرشل قارن كذلك الفلسطينيين بالسكان الأصليين في أستراليا، وأنت تقول في كتابك الأخير أن نوايا الإمبريالية الغربية كانت منذ البداية إبادية تجاه الفلسطينيين. كيف ذلك؟
Well, for Churchill, you know, the genocide against the North American native tribes, or the blacks, as he called them, the Aboriginal people in Australia, was not a big deal because civilization was entering their lands and those that survived would benefit from it. It was not a very debated question in those days. And for the Jews too, Churchill had a saying there are two types of Jews. One are the good Jews, who are the Zionists, and then there are bad Jews who are communists, socialists, non-Zionists. And these bad Jews are horrible people, and they made the Russian Revolution, which has given us huge problems. But so all we can do is to support the good Jews, i.e. the Zionists. That was his attitude, and he didn't regard it as very odd. And quite a lot of people in Britain just accepted that. You know, if you look at it from their point of view, here is a tiny island in the north which conquers large parts of the world. We did it. God was on our side. They used religion a lot. And it shows the superiority of white Western civilization. Whether it's the Arab world, whether it's Australia, whether it's Kenya, whether it's South Africa, that was their message. We are superior to you, we will crush you. And, you know, of course they knew that the superiority they had was because of technological advances and the fact that capitalism was born here. So they had weaponry and equipment with which native people couldn't compete. When they managed to get these weapons, they did fight back. It's not that there was no resistance to this at all. There was resistance, but it was crushed. I think the formation of Israel, by and large, as you know, the decision was taken by Blffor, who was also one of the more racist and anti-Semitic politicians here. One reason was get the Jews out of our countries. Why should they be here? In Britain, you know, there's a big debate on this. Stop the entry of more Jews into Britain. That also happened, you know. Blffor pushed through the Aliens Act, which stopped Jewish refugees from coming here. And secondly, it was that it would be good to have a semi-colonial state which will act together with us. And thirdly, it was money. I have to say this, Rothschild money. A lot of money was handed over. The propaganda was very strong. And this was long, long before the Judeocide of the Holocaust. So they were determined to create an entity in the Middle East, which the British thought they would be able to control, and which later the Americans took over and thought they would be able to control. Well, Britain didn't actually support the UN partition of Palestine, but the other countries did, and that was never observed by Israel. But to ask why they created it, it's like to have their own little state there. You know, it's as simple as that. And a state run by white settlers, mainly from Europe. You know, it was in the back of their minds was Rhodesia, the white settlers in Kenya, in South Africa. So if the white settlers are Jews, so what? They won't be here.
بعد عودته إلى السلطة في عام 51 لمدة 4 سنوات، أنهى تشرشل مسيرته السياسية بجريمتين إضافيتين. في عام 53 في إيران، مساندة الانقلاب ضد القومي محمد مصدق، ثم في 54 عملية السندان ضد الماو في كينيا. طارق علي، هل يمكنك أن تحدثنا أكثر عن هاتين الجريمتين؟
The situation as far as Iran is concerned, is very straightforward. The Iranians managed to elect a nationalist government led by Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a pre-Nasser. He was not as effective, he was very mild, but he was an Iranian nationalist. And he said, we want the British out of here. Why should they exploit our oil? And it was the decision by Mossadegh to nationalize the oil, which was being run by British companies, which was Churchill couldn't believe that this was happening. And he said, this guy to be overthrown. The Americans backed him up. So the toppling of Mossadegh and the bringing of the Shah and putting the Shah on the throne was basically an attempt to get their oil back. They never got it all back, but they did get some. And it was to punish the Iranian people for having elected a government. And, you know, when I say this to people who say, but the mullahs, I said, you created them. The mullahs, who are now in power, came to power partially with the overthrow of Mossadegh. They got enormous power, etc. The Shah didn't touch them particularly. So they were allowed to grow and grow and grow. And the left and the liberals were crushed, sometimes in the most brutal fashion. Churchill supported all that. The CIA guy who went and carried this out came back and reported first to Churchill. We have taken back Iran, and he was very happy. And Kenya is a similar thing, that they basically what the British wanted to do in Kenya, and Churchill was very strongly behind this, was to create a Rhodesia type situation where you settle more and more white settlers, give them the best lands, let them own those lands. That wealth will make them powerful, and they can rule over the blacks for a long time to come. That's what they started doing in the 50s, and a rebellion began, the Mau Mau Rebellion, which challenged the British, which carried out acts of violence against the British presence, and to which the British responded ferociously and viciously, creating concentration camps where they were kept through torture, through blackmail, through threatening their families. It was a horrific thing which they kept quiet about. You know, the images people saw was the royal family going to Kenya and beautiful little black Kenyan children welcoming them with flowers and Union Jacks. But that was not the reality behind the scene. The reality was far more vicious. And you know, it's quite interesting because most British historians have completely ignored the fact, except for a few who were very good. It wasn't until young American academics started writing books about it. This very brilliant, her name, Caroline Elkins. Caroline Elkins wrote the first book on Kenya, exposing British atrocities and comparing them to the gulags, and that shook them. Then British historians, because an American had done this, had to sit up and take notice. And then she wrote another book on British imperial war crimes, which is a very good book. So it's interesting that the big attack on this came from historians in the American Academy.
طارق علي، كيف تفسر تجاهل هؤلاء المؤرخين البريطانيين للجرائم الاستعمارية لبلدهم؟
It was partially ignorance. Very few of the papers had been made public at the time. And quite a lot of British historians, after all, were in favor of colonialism. You know, they didn't exist in the middle of the sky. They were people who brought up here, taught here. Their parents, in many cases, had been in the colonies. So it took them a long time to discover this. They basically accepted, consciously or subconsciously, the propaganda that was being used by the British government. Well, he did to a certain extent, and that you can't take away from him. He was the most vigorous defender of the British Empire, and had pledged that while he was in power, he would not preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. He was, you know, quite an old guy. He was a person from the 19th century who had lived for many years in the 20th century. The question is this about Churchill, is had he not been made Prime Minister during the Second World War, would he have become this figure? So it's on a few years in power during a critically important European war that Churchill was on the right side, in the sense that he understood that A, Hitler threatened the British Empire, B, the Germans had to be defeated or they would take it over, and therefore it was foolish not to be prepared for a German attack. He was an English patriot, imperial patriot. And but the thing that is interesting is that this cult of Churchill that we see today, it started after Thatcher's attack on the Falklands, the Malvinas, and they started using Churchill for these purposes. When Churchill was actually alive, or even soon after his death, there are lots of criticisms. You know, there were plays, there was satire, there was attacks. And Churchill, even when he was alive, didn't mind this, to be fair to him. He replied in kind, but he didn't say, oh, stop attacking me, it's lazy. So that is a modern invention by Margaret Thatcher and the Labour prime ministers who've followed her. I mean, Labour during the Second World War was very many parts of Labour were very critical of Churchill. Many leading politicians inside the Labour Party. That stopped too with the Falklands War. So we have this anomaly. I don't think it'll last permanently, but it's there at the moment.
أنت اعتبرت أن كتابك قبل الأخير الذي خصصته للينين عمل مقاوم باعتبار مركزية الثورة البلشفية في القرن الماضي. كيف يمكن حسب رأيك للينين أن يساعد الأجيال الجديدة اليوم على التفكير في الثورة، على التفكير في طبيعة الدولة، على التفكير في عالم أكثر عدالة؟
Well, Lenin was a supreme realist. He never liked thinking just in the abstract. It's very remarkable about him. In my book on Lenin, the dilemmas of Lenin, I go into this in detail. And it was only when he was convinced, where Lenin was very brilliant is he could smell the change, the shifts taking place in mass consciousness. And at a time when his own party was opposed to making a revolution, Lenin fought against them and was in a minority of 2-3 on the Politburo, because he said we're getting support from the workers of the factories. They're ahead of the party leaders. And he used this growing mass radicalization to defeat the more conservative elements within the Bolshevik party. So yes, and that was his capability, and his prestige was enormous, because he had been writing for years and years and years about what was happening to Russia, etc. And Churchill actually said about Lenin that he had one of the most brilliant minds of the world, but unfortunately, he said, the filter turned red. It's not untrue, but it wasn't an accident that the filter turned red. It was because Lenin could see what was going on, and where he's very relevant for us today is in understanding he was very strong anti-colonialist. And I think sometimes people underestimate how much the Russian Revolution did to accelerate decolonization. It was the triumph of the Russian Revolution that made the imperial powers realize that if our colonial enemies, the people in the colonies, unite with Russia, that's it, we'll go down as well. They used to say it quite openly. And so that gave a big boost to the anti-colonial movement. And of course, even in Russia itself, Lenin insisted that any ethnic group that wanted to separate from the old Tsarist state could do so. It was inscribed in the Soviet constitution, the right of nations to leave the Union, the right of nations to self-determination. And that's what was hated by some Russians. But that was, Lenin said this empire was created by the Tsars. If they want to leave, let them leave. But we should obviously try and do so much for them that they don't want to leave, which to a certain extent they did. It can't be denied.
سؤالي الأخير حول بلدك الأول باكستان. كما تعلم شهدت باكستان مظاهرات ضخمة مناصرة للحق الفلسطيني، فهل تثير حرب الإبادة اليوم على غزة توترات بين النظام العسكري الباكستاني والولايات المتحدة من جهة، ومن جهة أخرى بين النظام العسكري الباكستاني والجار الهند الحليف الاستراتيجي لإسرائيل؟
I think the people in Pakistan are completely for the Palestinians. The government is run by the army, and the army tries to maintain a balance with the United States, not to upset them too much. So it's like Turkey. They haven't done any, they have said, yes, we all support the Palestinians, and they haven't stopped any demonstrations, but they have done nothing else. And Pakistan is a very important country in the region because it has nuclear weapons. The Israelis have nuclear weapons. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. So there has been a lot of pressure on Pakistan by the United States to recognize Israel. They have not done it. A friend of mine, Khurshid Mahmood Qasuri, who was foreign minister for some time, many years ago, he was ordered by the army to shake hands with an Israeli minister at some conference. So this picture was published in Pakistan, and lots of people abused him. His own people close to him said, "Why did you do that? We don't want your hand cut off by some crazy people here. Why did you shake hands?" He said it was for state reasons. And the Israelis just wanted some indication. So Pakistan, they fear, has given nuclear know-how to Iran. And I think the Israelis suspect that Iran can manufacture its own bomb. I think that's true, but so what? No one talks about the Israeli bomb. They want to maintain a monopoly of that, so that if they use it, there's no response. It's crazy, really, to think in those terms. So Pakistan's position has been not to do anything, but not to stop people saying whatever they want to say. And the government also, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, they attack what the Israelis are doing in Palestine. But that's all. India is a huge supporter of Israel since the Modi people came into power, for two reasons. One is that it helps to stoke up Islamophobia and anti-Muslim feelings in India. And the second is they sell a lot of arms to Israel. And the third is that Modi likes to show Pakistan, look, we are close to the Israelis. We can do to Kashmir what they have done to Palestine. If you don't, so it's used as a constant pressure, but it's very symbolic because when the British and French and Israelis attacked Egypt in 1956, the Pakistan government supported Britain. The Indian government, led by Nehru, supported Nasser. And out of that was born the non-aligned movement. And lots of children that year, in 56, 57, in Egypt, were named Nehru, because people never forgot that at a critical moment they had got support from India and not Pakistan. And now it's the complete opposite, in the sense the Indians openly support Israel. I mean, when I was interviewed by a big Indian magazine not so long ago, and I said, no, not a single big demonstration in Delhi. The whole world is marching for Palestine except India. They're very embarrassed. I said, we know the government. But what's happened to the left, the communist parties, the social movements? They said, you're right. It hasn't happened and it's a bad thing.
شكرا جزيلا طارق علي على وقتك وإجاباتك المفيدة والقيمة.
Thank you.